Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to another session of the workshop in the history of material text. Now in our 31st year of weekly meetings, believe it or not, and I don't totally believe it. And welcome to everyone on Zoom. I see people here from very far away, France, Italy, Turkey.
Wow.
Welcome to all of you. We're glad to have you with us. Just remember to turn on the mute. Do use the chat, which should be open now, and during Q&A, use that raise hand function, and we can call on you to ask your question live. Also, the sign-in sheet, I think, is going around again since a bunch of people came in late, so please just note your name down there for bureaucratic paperwork, and add your email to that sheet if you are not on our listserv and would like to be, and you'll get a weekly email and not much more than that. Occasional notices, but you won't be spammed with a ton of two weekly emails and the occasional interesting info about events in the region.
Like when Emma Smith is speaking multiple times.
Exactly. So, no spoiler, but I'm very pleased to welcome Emma Smith to the workshop today. Emma is here with us this week to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the publication of the First Folio of Shakespeare. She will be giving a public lecture on Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. right back here in this room, called "What is Shakespeare's First Folio and Why Should I Care?" And everyone is welcome at that talk as well. It should be a great one. It is in person only for Wednesday. Just one note on that. Tomorrow, also for graduate students only, she'll be running a lunchtime discussion and mentoring session. So if you are a graduate student and would like to attend but are not yet registered, you can just come see me after, and I can tell you how to do that. And I also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors for the 3-day Emma Stravaganza, which are the Kislak Center, the Wolf Humanities Center, the English Department, and the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies. So and of course, the Material Text Workshop. And we really appreciate all of the help from everyone there. Okay, Emma Smith is Professor of Shakespeare Studies and a Fellow of Hertford College, Oxford, one of the world's leaders in textual studies and early modern book history. She's published numerous books, including 2 on the First Folio, one on its production, The Making of Shakespeare's First Folio, published by the Bodleian Library, which famously de-accessioned its First Folio as a duplicate when they got a hold of the Third Folio, so they have to make up for it. And one on its reception, Shakespeare's First Folio, 4 Centuries of an Iconic Book, published by Oxford in 2016 and reissued this year with a new preface. Most recent is Portable Magic, A History of Books and Their Readers from Penguin. This book is aimed at all readers, as you can tell from its publisher, and I love how it introduces the general public to the kind of work those of us who come to this workshop do, but without sacrificing any of the rigor, detail, and subtlety of interpretation that the best of this work requires. One of my favorite chapters, for example, is on the shelfie, that phenomenon of the Zoom years when we were looking at the books behind everyone's head on the screen. And Emma traces this phenomenon from the 1646 portrait of Lady Anne Clifford back to medieval portraiture and forward to photographs of Marilyn Monroe, who was pictured reading Whitman's Leaves of Grass and Joyce's Ulysses, among other books. This is a highly engaging chapter that draws people to the field of book history, certainly, but it's simultaneously a deeply researched study of the representation of women readers and their books. Emma has written a series of important textual studies of Shakespeare, often with her colleague Laurie McGuire, on revision and collaboration, Shakespeare's use of sources, feminist editing and history, and other topics. And these have been highly influential in the field. I think of them as a kind of ongoing series, though I don't know if they're conceived in that way. More influential, I think, than individual essays often are. And when a new essay appears, emails tend to go around the field like, wake up, new Emma Smith textual study just dropped. And she's put her textual theory to work, editing a number of early modern plays. She's currently completing her edition of Twelfth Night for the Arden. I say currently completing, no pressure. for the Arden Shakespeare 4th series, and that is the topic of our talk tonight. So please join me in welcoming Emma Smith.
So thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks to all those sponsors. Thanks to everybody on Zoom. Anybody who does material texts really wants to be at Penn. So it's great for me to be here just these 3 days. This is the I think this is the sort of intellectual home of the discipline because of those 31 years. So it's fantastic for me to join the conversation here. I'm going to be talking about Twelfth Night. I don't know who's here. Would anybody find it useful for me to just back up and say a bit about the plot of Twelfth Night, or does everybody feel happy with that? Let's do that, just in case you're not on top of it, because people are coming from different disciplines, I know. In fact, one of the most difficult things to do with a Shakespeare play is actually to summarize it. Does that seem okay? Okay. I'm actually, I am here. I really am here. Is to summarize it, but let's just try and do that. So, Twelfth Night takes place in Illyria, where Orsino, the count, is in love with Olivia. She is not interested in him. Into this scenario comes Viola, shipwrecked. For reasons that we'll discuss, she decides to dress herself in men's clothing and go to be the servant of Orsino, who sends her as his emissary to the reluctant Olivia, who falls in love with him or her. In order to resolve this triangle, where in order to resolve this triangle, happily, there is a twin brother, Sebastian. He has also been shipwrecked, but saved a little bit for the plot, but emerges into the play to sort of swoop in, take up Olivia, and allow Viola to pair off with Orsino. Kind of that's broadly the shape, but the difficulties in that are the things that I want to try to talk about. So I'm just going to share a PowerPoint. I'm sorry for the people on Zoom that you won't be able to come and see the exhibits that are out today, but I hope that the PowerPoint will be good for you to look at. Okay, so here we are. So, in fact, actually, I want to go back. So there are three elements of textual editing that I want to try and work with. Sorry, I'm needing quite a lot of management.
No.
I'm so sorry. There are three elements of textual editing that I want to think about. Ideas of editing early modern text, particularly editing Shakespeare, that I think have become axiomatic. And I want to try and use a couple of examples to think about what those axioms mean. The first is the idea that when we edit Shakespeare now, we should be thinking about the play as drama or as theatre. So that's one of the big shifts in editorial theory, as many of you may know. So through the 18th century, we've got some amazing 18th century books out on the table here. You'll see that some of the annotations suggest that the reason there are bits in that the editor doesn't really like is because the players have added them in. There's two or three examples that I've picked out there. It's an age which is deeply regretful of the idea that Shakespeare had to write for the theatre, and tends to blame the audience for anything that it thinks is not decorous or not proper or not well expressed. There's a lovely example of Theobald saying about with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain, which is the song which ends the play. This is nothing to do with Shakespeare. This is all the players. Mm-hmm. So the editorial theory of the middle centuries was really wished that Shakespeare had been able to be a poet, had not had to write for the theatre, and tended to disdain the theatricality, perceived theatricality of the text as something that needed to be stripped out. And really that sort of anti-theatrical, or at least not very theatrical, attitude to Shakespeare by editors continued surprisingly late into the 20th century. So, for example, Harold Jenkins' edition of Arden, the Arden Hamlet, the Arden II Hamlet, has numerous footnotes where he says that this is something that the players suggested. This is something for actors. This isn't really necessarily an authoritative or Shakespearean aspect of the text. It's an interesting distinction that Shakespeare, the playwright, might somehow nevertheless be distinct from the theatrical manifestations of his text. What changed with Arden III, the series of Shakespeare editing, which began in the 1990s and has just completed in the early 2020s, what changed there was a sense that Shakespeare should be edited with the stage in mind. But what that tended to mean was a relatively small section of theatre history, sometimes a sort of extended list of performances at the end of the introduction, not usually a completely integrated sense that details from the actual performance history, both our sense of what original performance might have been and subsequent ones, or our sense of the possibilities of performance. I don't think there was much sense that that was really integrated into the editorial tradition, but it was certainly being included. And as Zach said, we are now just beginning the next Arden series, the Arden IV. And again, theatre is at the heart of that iteration, and it will be interesting to see how theatre makes its place felt. So that's one aspect that I want to bear in mind, the idea that theatre, when we edit Shakespeare, we're supposed to be thinking about Shakespeare theatrically. The second is, I think, something about the proper sphere of editorial practice. And what editors have tended to do in editing actually any text is to reach backwards to draw evidence about how the text might have been understood, might have been represented in print, might have been transmitted. That's to say, I think editing has tended to be quite a retrospective genre. If you can find a kind of parallel to what you're editing, ideally it needs to be earlier than the text. And if it's later, its helpfulness as a parallel, or the extent to which it can be admitted a parallel, is really quite damaged in traditional editorial theory. So if you were thinking about what Shakespeare might be drawing on, it would seem self-evident, but I hope not completely self-evident, so much that we can't really talk about it. But it would nevertheless seem self-evident that the things Shakespeare must be drawing on must have predated the play. That may or may not be an obvious point, but there may be some more interesting things that we can do with that. So that's so one is about editing and theatre. One is about editing and chronology, if you like. What is the kind of chronology of editing? And of course here, I'm thinking about editing gender and sexuality and sex. Of course, the ideas of queer chronology are very useful in thinking about that. How we can disrupt, what kind of methodologies we can draw on that can disrupt some of those rather sort of unexamined priorities, the unexamined sense that what you're drawing on when you edit is things which predate the thing that you're editing. And so related to that, the third of my sort of questions is how far editing has anything like the critical obligations, critical obligations that I think we have all, I hope we have all come to think as crucial to literary study and to the humanities more generally. I think Black Lives Matter, but also lots of other wake-ups, and I'm completely conscious that to say it was a wake-up is a complete sign of privilege, but a wake-up for me, and perhaps for other people present. That has made us think a lot more about the obligation of our work to contribute to forms of social justice, to engage with difficult questions about our histories, but with the aim of some kind of reconciliation or regeneration, something better or recuperative in the future. Now, editing has seemed traditionally a very long way from those kinds of commitments. It has seemed, I think, to be, although it may have had a sense that you brought texts into the mainstream. There was definitely a moment when people edited text by women, for instance, and that had a very definite politics to it. But the editing of a text like Shakespeare has not seemed, I think, mostly to have those kinds of commitments. And I want to just ask a little bit about those and enjoy the discussion about whether those are admissible, whether they're necessary, how we might pursue them, whether there are any counter indications to that. So they're the three sort of larger points that I want to touch on, but I'm going to do that in a very book history-ish way, which is via some really small examples. You know how we do this. The question about the gap between the gap of scale, the toggle between the micro and the macro, is one of the ongoing methodological questions, isn't it, for this part of our discipline? And I'm really happy to talk through that together. Okay, so let's think about this play, Twelfth Night. If you saw this play in the theatre, if you saw this play at the Globe in London in 1601 or 1602, if you saw it at the Middle Temple, which was actually its first documented performance, in the legal education in London, if you saw it in any kind of modern theatre where you had not bought a programme, what you would see is a woman entering the stage in the second scene, and you would never know what her name was. Okay, so you would never know that this character, Viola, is called Viola until the last 20 minutes of the play. So, of course, reading the play is completely different. Viola's identity, her name, continues to be amplified in the apparatus of the play. Here we've got Enter Viola, a captain and sailors. This is her first entry, and Viola's speech prefix is VIO. So we've already, in the first sort of 3 minutes of her entrance on the page, got 1, 2, 3, 4 versions of her name. But again, just to reiterate, if we were watching this, we wouldn't have any sense what her name was. Viola takes the decision in this first scene to take herself as a eunuch to serve Orsino. I'm not particularly going to talk about the questions of being a eunuch, but I'd be really interested to do that in the discussion. What transpires is that Viola turns up here in her next appearance in man's attire. You see the stage direction there. Enter Viola in man's attire. And then if you can see a little bit further down that clip that I've given you, these are all First Folio clips, the first witness for this play. Duke, and then we get the way that the theatre helps us understand what a person's called. Who saw Cesario? Ho, says the Duke. On your attendance, my lord, here. Stand you a while aloof, Cesario, thou knowest no less. It's a really common feature when it's important for us to know someone's name. We get it 2 or 3 times so we can tune in and hear it. And we get it twice here, and Viola says, "Oh, that's me. That's me." So this is the moment of sort of transition for theatre audiences, but less so for readers. So theatre audiences now have a name for this character, and the name is Cesario. Readers have a sense, here is Viola in man's attire, now called Cesario. And let's just look at these other examples. There's a sort of a wild card in the next scene, which is enter violenta. I think that must be because the manuscript has an abbreviated form of viola, perhaps has V. There are some other examples of this where we can see that, for example, master or mistress have been wrongly expanded out from an abbreviated form. So that may be here. There is a character violenta in All's Well That Ends Well, although it would be kind of odd for a compositor to have that figure so firmly in his mind. But anyway, a little hiccup about the naming, but still recognizably viola, perhaps. And then just to give you a few other examples, enter viola and Malvolio, enter Duke viola, Curio and Lords, and in Act 5, again, viola, the speech prefix is viola. So what's interesting to me about this is that the stage directions, if these are stage directions, are they, I mean, in a way, they're kind of reading directions, maybe, directions for readers, whether that's what they're intended, that's certainly what they become, isn't it? Because we are reading them, mostly not putting on a play, certainly not from the First Folio, which is much too big and unwieldy to do that. These directions don't really invest in the character of Cesario. They don't continue to remind us that Viola is in man's attire, and they certainly never transferred the name of this character from Viola to Cesario. So when we get these subsequent entries, we're just getting Viola, not the sense of disguise at all. That one in 2-2 is kind of interesting. Enter Viola and Malvolio at several doors. I mean, that is a direction from the theatre. The doors are in the theatre. They're not in the fiction. They're not in. They're not in a house with a lot of doors where they're sort of playing a kind of farce kind of game. That the several doors are the two doors in the theatre, which are used sort of symbolically to signal that people have come from different directions and met there, rather than that they've arrived together. So there are lots of odd ways that these stage directions toggle us between a consciousness of theatre and a consciousness of reading. But the point I want to get from that is that this is these subsequent instantiations of Viola are committed to the female name and the female character, and not committed to reminding us about Cesario. And then I just wanted to show you this bit here, which I'm just going to actually highlight. So this is the moment in the play when Sebastian and Viola, the two twins, are reunited. So they have been separated at sea. They neither of them quite know that the other is still alive, but all the strange things that keep happening sort of, I guess, gradually help them to see that that might be the outcome. And then they have this scene of reconciliation, recognition in the play's final act. It's often said that the recovery of the relationship between the twins is much more significant to this play than either of the marriages or any of the three marriages, which seem to end the romantic comedy. That where this play is heading is to a resolution which is about the coming together of the boy-girl twins, rather than the coming together of these slightly problematized marital relationships. So here we can see Sebastian and Viola finding their way to recognize each other. I had do I stand there? I never had a brother, says Sebastian, nor can there be that deity in my nature of here and everywhere. I had a sister whom the blind waves and surges have devoured. Of charity, what kin are you to me? What countryman? What name? What parentage? Of Messalene, Viola says, Sebastian was my father. Such a Sebastian was my brother too. So went he suited to his watery tomb. If spirits can assume both form and suit, you come to fright us. So we get the double Sebastian, but then let's look at what Sebastian recognized. Were you a woman as the rest goes even, I should my tears let fall upon your cheek and say, thrice welcome, drowned Viola. My father had a mole upon his brow, and so had mine, and died that day when Viola from her birth had numbered 13 years. And then a little bit further down. If nothing lets to make us happy both, but this my masculine usurped attire, do not embrace me till each circumstance of place, time, fortune do cohere, and jump that I am Viola, which to confirm, I'll bring you to a captain in this town where lie my maiden weeds. So for the audience, this is the first time we hear this name, and we hear it 3 times in quite close succession to establish it. What's really, really, really striking to me about the rest of the play is that nobody else uses it. Nobody picks it up. Nobody says, oh, okay, now we understand why you're so girlish, or, you know, the maiden's pipe. And there are lots of comments about how Cesario is not hyper masculine, and nobody says, oh yeah, now that makes sense, because really you're called Viola. Nobody seems to pick up this name, and in fact quite the opposite. This is Orsino at the end. Meantime, sweet sister, he's talking to Olivia, we shall not part from hence. Cesario, come, for so you shall be while you are a man, but when in other habits you are seen, Orsino's mistress and his fancied queen. Like many comic heroines, Viola, having been quite rhetorically dominant and powerful, is utterly silenced by the end of the play. We don't hear anything from her for quite a few minutes. So I went through the number of references to Cesario, which is 18, and the number of references to Viola in the text of the play, which is 3. That made me think about why we call characters particular names, what's invested in those in those names. Just as we're looking here, you can see that the end of the play, when that I was but a little tiny boy, the song that Theobald said was by the actors, is given to the character Clown. Certainly by the 20th century, it became completely commonplace to call this character Feste, as if Clown is a role and Feste is a name, but Feste is also a role. I mean, it's a name that comes from festival, or you know, it's a name, more importantly to me, that occurs just once in the text of the play. Throughout the First Folio, this is a character called Clown, and then somebody calls him Feste the Jester, which might suggest it was actually Festa the Jester. You know, that there's a kind of joke about that. It doesn't necessarily make it clear that that's his name. Anyway, so names are kind of important, and what we do with those names. Let's have a look at some examples of that. So I've got 2 modern editions, the Folger, which has Enter Valentine and Viola in man's attire as Cesario, and then continues with Viola. And then the next time, Enter Viola, the Honourable Lady of the House, which is C. And then a quick look at the Arden 3, Keir Elam's Arden 3, Enter Valentine and Viola in man's attire as Cesario. And then Elam opts to remind us every time Viola enters that Viola is as Cesario. This is the new Oxford Shakespeare, the most recent complete edition from 2016. This is all quite interesting to me. Enter Valentine and Viola as Cesario in man's attire. But then the note is actually, to me, very troubling, really, really troubling. Viola's hair might also be cropped, and she might wear a false moustache, though not a beard. See 3:136. Viola might struggle to speak in a deeper male voice, or to move in a masculine manner. I mean, that's come from nowhere, but that's a sense that Viola in man's attire is pretending, play acting, not very good at it, is going to be revealing an underlying and authentic femininity by being not very good at being a man. There's something troubling about this assumption of a lack of skill or of a lack of authenticity, a lack of believability. This is a sort of this seems to me it seems to me actually a very unsophisticated idea about gender passing and about all kinds of forms of presentation. But I haven't given you what we continue to get, but it's we continue to get Viola as Cesario. And here you can see in this same pane that I've got here, right at the bottom, Stangua Viola Luf to Viola Cesario, thou knowest no less but all. So there's something very insistent here that Viola is not just called Viola, but Viola is a woman who wouldn't be very good at being a man. She wouldn't be able to pass as a man. The other example is from the it's a fantastic glorious sun picking me out like a halo. Please don't stop it. It's amazing to see the sun. I come from England, remember? I must I'm going to start with sort of a humming and the other one is the Wells and Taylor Oxford Shakespeare from 2005, which also goes for the enter Viola as Cesario, enter Viola as Cesario. Okay. I want to hold that for a moment and just move to one other example that I want to talk about. And here I want to think about the way that characters are organized in the lists of roles, lists of characters, which since Nicholas Rowe in 1709 have become completely standard. And we haven't got a volume of Rowe because it was actually rather fragile, but we've got all the examples that follow on from him. And I wanted to introduce this in particular to think about one aspect of the play. And it's about Sebastian, who we've already met, and his companion, Antonio. Now, almost all modern productions of this play present Antonio and Sebastian as having some kind of erotic relationship. The more conservative end of that is to say, broadly, I do get that these are not historically all that comfortable, but they're easy to work with. Say that broadly, Antonio fancies Sebastian, but Sebastian doesn't fancy Antonio. That's the most conservative way that we can have this kind of relationship, because that allows the kind of heteronormative ending that, of course, Sebastian will marry Olivia because he's really straight. But there are other ways to think about that, but certainly to think about the character of Antonio. And I've just given you an example which from the play, which I think in the work I've been doing is under annotated. This is Sebastian goes off. It's a brilliant moment that the men they're having an argument. They're breaking up really. Sebastian says, "I'm going. I've got to go. It's not me. It's you. No, it's not you. It's me." That he says that, but with that sense that it's always the wrong way around. Don't ask me where I'm going. Don't follow me. Don't follow me. I'm going to Orsino's court. Don't follow me. Don't follow me. And then he leaves, and Antonio has just this short moment of soliloquy. The gentleness of all the gods go with thee. I have many enemies in Orsino's court, else would I very shortly see thee there. But come what may, I do adore thee so, that danger shall seem sport, and I will go. That word adore is really, really striking. We know that men said that they loved each other. We know that male friendship and male love was the highest form of kind of bonding and sympathy in the period. We all know that. But adore is not part of that lexicon. Adore is something that you say about a kind of godly figure. You can use it in religious terms, but it is not the word for the kind of mutual, reciprocal male friendship, which was such a crucial part of early modern culture. And I think adore gets slightly under annotated here. We get when we when Sir Andrew, who's a sort of sideline character who is the sort of butt of everybody's jokes, when Sir Andrew remembers, "I was adored once too," we know that means someone was in love with him. We don't think he had a good friend. We think someone was in love with him. So, how then should we describe Antonio? And what is the work that Dramatis personae lists do for us? Firstly, why do we need them? It's interesting that in the First Folio, there are 7 plays that have lists of characters. They're all at the end of the play, rather strangely. This is a very pen remark, because it was most brilliantly talked about in Peter Salibras and Margrethe de Grazia's Materiality of the Shakespearean Text article 20 some years ago. Salibras and de Grazia point out that the absence of character lists before the play suggests that the characters in the play don't pre-exist their own speeches. So they talk themselves into being, they come through speaking rather than they report on their identities which exist outside the play. It's a fantastic observation, but it has certainly become absolutely standard in the printing of plays for us to have a list of characters. And there's no list of characters in Twelfth Night until Rowe in 1709. So I was really interested in Rowe's list, and here it is. Orsino, Duke of Illyria; Sebastian, a young gentleman, brother to Viola; Antonio, a sea captain, friend to Sebastian; Valentine and Curio, gentlemen attending on the Duke; Sir Toby Belch, uncle to Olivia; Sir Andrew Aguecheek, a foolish knight, pretending to Olivia; a sea captain, friend to Viola; Fabian, servant to Olivia; Malvolio, a fantastical steward to Olivia; clown, servant to Olivia; Olivia, a lady of great beauty and fortune, beloved by the Duke; Viola, in love with the Duke; Maria, confidant to Olivia; priests, sailors, officers, and other attendants. So it's a nice example of these lists which try to enmesh characters in relationships. So they try to sort of map out something about the sort of emotional or hierarchical. Sometimes emotional is hierarchical, sometimes perhaps not. Relationship between the different characters. It's very standard at this point to put the male characters at the top and the female characters underneath. And it's very standard to identify characters with reference to other their relationship to other characters. So interested in Antonio as a friend to Sebastian. Friend can mean in this period lover, as it can in the Shakespearean period. Measure has got his friend with child. Although I don't think the sea captain is that kind of friend to Viola. And in fact, interesting that these two sea captains look in this characters as if they're equivalent, so they're structurally equivalent. That's not at all how it seems in the play, where the sea captain in relation to Viola is there in that opening scene, that Act 1, Scene 2 that we've looked at, and never again. But that's how Rowe sets them out. And I'm just going to see what seems available to us now in more modern editions. Sorry if this is a bit crunched up, but firstly, we don't know what this list is called. Nicholas Rowe was very clear that it was called Dramatis personae, in that strange way that quite a lot of the apparatus of play printing is Latinate. So too in the First Folio, intermittently, where act and scene numbers are given in Latin. But here we've got the roles in the play, the characters in the play, etc. Viola, twin sister to Sebastian, so I'm looking from left to right, later disguised as Cesario. I'm very interested in that word, later disguised as Cesario, which in fact we get in all four of these contemporary lists. So there are other women who dress as men in Shakespeare's comedies, as you know. In As You Like It, we get about an hour of Rosalind before she becomes Ganymede. In Two Gentlemen of Verona, we've had about an hour and 3/4 of Julia. Same, probably a bit more in Merchant of Venice. They seem like occasions where you might say, this is a person later, somebody. We'll come back to disguised maybe in a minute. But Viola appears on the shore, says, where am I? Who's here? I think I'm going to dress as the eunuch. And then the next time we see her, there she is in Manzatile. We've seen that stage direction. That's not a lot later, but something about that word later is again reiterating the Viola-ness, I think, and weighting the play towards the Viola identity, when really, as we've seen, the entirety of the play operates within the Cesario identity. Here we've got a sea captain and then another sea captain, which seems a bit sad for Antonio to be only another sea captain. I mean, if in the 18th century Rowe could see that he is a friend to Sebastian, it seems harsh that we can't do that now. And then looking across, maybe here we've got the Oxford one is the third one along. A shipwrecked lady, later disguised as Cesario. I do get that lady has class, social status implications, but there's something very gendered about it, isn't there? Captain of the wrecked ship, nice bit of narrative backstory there, who befriends Viola, and then a sea captain who befriends Sebastian. I mean, unless that other sea captain is working quite hard off stage, I don't think these two befriends are the same at all. And it seems to me misleading at the very least, and homophobic at the most, perhaps, to describe them in that way. Let's look at another sea captain. We've got a lady, later disguised as Cesario. Interesting in the Folger, an interesting sense that place is important. A lady of Messaline, shipwrecked on the coast of Illyria. It's a very sort of geographical kind of Viola, later disguised as Cesario. Interesting that Cesario is in the block caps that signal a name, a proper name in the Folger editorial conventions, although we never get that name in that form in the text. But we do at least get Antonio's friend to Sebastian is allowed there. So these are my questions. These are big questions. Our characters people, our characters' identities. What's at stake in claiming Antonio as a gay prototype? What's at stake in claiming some kind of continuities in those identities? That's something which historical constructions of sex and gender have told us is wrong. That's slightly changing, I think, now, as we tend to be looking for slightly different things particularly in the canonical texts that we look at in the past. I'd be interested in your views on that. Do we owe it to recognize echoes of modern identities in historic texts, or is that exactly what we should not be doing? Is that the editor's job to shut that out? Is editing inevitably retrospective, or can it be more future-facing? Is the text now or then? And how long is now? I mean, how now would now be? That's partly an issue because, particularly in Shakespeare editing, this is a cyclical process. As soon as Arden 3 had barely finished, Arden 3 had not finished when Arden 4 set itself up. So it's a slightly different question in the Shakespeare editing than from works that will only get one edition in a long generation, where you might have different kinds of obligations. And then my final slide. Almost certainly true. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. That was great. I'm gonna can you unpin let's see, remove spotlight. That's what I'm gonna do, because I like, that way we don't see two of you.
Oh, great.
And we
Okay.
see everyone
Perfect.
who's joining us. Okay, the floor is open. Liliana can, as usual, ask the first question.
Actually, just
If I
kick
can.
Zach, just kick the.
Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I wonder whether you can get a little bit more on the notion of performance. Because it seems to me that there are two performances in this case. One is the performance of characters performance. So they're coming on stage, they're dressing up and doing all kinds of. The other is the performance of names. And that seems much more resistant. And what you have shown in certain instances is where the name does not perform while the body does. And I'm kind of thinking that totally anachronistically to a seminar we had recently on what a name is listening on language and what the name could mean for language, whether it could tell some truth that other words after the fall and so on do not tell. So that is his particular state. But I'm also thinking if you compare the state of religion and so on, where again what's in a name is articulated, whether one cannot also talk about a certain fiction about the performance of the name in the play and the performance of the bodies and the characters, and what it means then for Shakespeare.
That's a lovely question. So so your idea is that the bodily performances are malleable in some way, and that nominative the nominative resists performance in a way. It's not the different kind of performance. It seems as if it resists performance. Hmm. I suppose one point about that might be whether when names, who chooses the name. So the name that you choose to be called might conform to other kinds of performance of the self that you are initiating, which is why a change of name is often one of the social signals of a change of other kinds of aspects of identity. So I wonder if there's a difference between the names that are chosen by the self and the names that are imposed. The Romeo and Juliet point is about having names as well as everything else imposed, isn't it, by families. Cesario feels like a name that somewhere Viola has chosen and is sort of a bit unwilling to give up.
It's basically the question of
yeah, and that's an amazingly great question for a play to ask, isn't it? When none of these people are Viola or Cesario, they are William Gough or, I mean, they are actors. You're making me think of one of the ways that those character lists work in the folio is that sometimes we get the heading, the names of the actors. Now, for us, that would cue, a list of performers, the real names of the performers. But in the first folio, it cues a list of the characters. Or something connected in mind.
Yes, we'll go here. Then Marissa, then Jerry.
Just following up on that question, it actually seems like there are three distinctions, because what you were pointing to in terms of the text and who was reading the text as on a page sitting in there wherever, there's a different persistence of the name Viola that doesn't occur on stage, but there's the almost primacy of Shakespeare giving Viola the name Viola is different even from that. seems to me.
Yeah, I love what you just said there, because that's made me think that Viola has much less room for play, let's call it that, on the page. Now that may be obvious, that may be true of all of us, but Viola is more clearly Viola on the pages of the First Folio, and is more insistently Viola in most of the modern editions that I have looked at, than a performance would allow, unless you think it's going to be a performance that the New Oxford imagines, where Viola is always being, yeah, and is always clear to us that Viola is really a woman, because she's not very good at pretending to be a man.
So thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and it provides so much reinforcement to a thing that I've noticed quite a lot, where my students come to class and half of them are like Cesario, half or Viola, right? So they are divided on who this character is that they've met before class. But I think your example of the row 1709 character list starts to get us some answers to your first question that you asked us are characters people or identities? And I think in the case of the row character list, that they are relational identities to one another, and that seems to be the history of the character list, where all these characters are being defined based on who they are, the people in the play, that kind of network. Whether they're class identities, whether it's guys later, there's something there that the character lists are doing that I think emphatically says yes, that these characters are people and identities, and here's how you're going to be able to track with them. So I don't think that actually gets to answering your question, which is a much bigger question, but thinking with you on that, this character list, I think they're doing something really
that's a great reason, because it also, I mean, if you were to think, to try and cut through where we've got to about sort of personhood, what do people think? What was it to be a person in not in a play, but in Elizabethan England? It was to be master to X or servant to Y. It seems to have been a relational. I think that's what we now understand identity to have been, relational to other people around, a kind of an identity which is anchored or sort of talked against other people. It's not yourself alone or kind of autonomous, and the people who suggest that are terribly frightening, kind of sociopaths. So you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought that before, to think that Rowe, in conjuring the play world, is actually conjuring a world of relational identities, which is not specific, not in any way specific to theatre. Yeah, thank you.
Let's go to Jerry, and then Liza will come to you next.
I join the chorus of thanks for the your final comment that the Arden 3 is finished, so we need to start the Arden 4. Makes it all sound like painting the Golden Gate Bridge, right? And that leads me to ask, to what extent are the kinds of questions you ask about editing, kind of general questions that you ask about editing, versus how the specific questions that you're asking and the specific issues that you have raised are very especially imposed by the Shakespeare industry on you?
Yeah, I think there is. So in some ways, if we just to pick up those terms, in some ways, editing Shakespeare seems a very, very high stakes thing to be doing. It's it's so wonderful. People will sort of be annoyed if you do this or don't do that. It feels like a sort of career-defining thing to do. On the other hand, of all the editing that one might do, it's probably the lowest stakes, in that anybody who doesn't like your edition can look at 10 others, or 50 can look at 10 others in the bookstore, 100 200 others in a library, and someone else will redo this work with the new clarity of whatever in 15 years' time. So in some ways that's very permissive, and it feels perhaps a bit less, the Shakespeareness of it makes it feel a bit less as if you're doing this for all time. And I think the sense of doing it for all time has been one of the ways that editing has tended to adopt a slightly magisterial tone, a sort of faux objective tone. It's probably one of the areas where you would see a first person least, and you would see passive constructions about how textual transmission has worked most. So you're there's a feeling perhaps that the editor needs to be less present, or has. I mean, the editors are not less present, and the 18th century was full of furiously present editors. But nevertheless, I think the tradition that many of us feel we've inherited is of a kind of writing which is irenic and sort of rises above the mere the now. But perhaps with Shakespeare, there's no need to do that, and we should embrace the now. What would I think ideas about gender, sex, sexuality, and identity are in such huge flux right now that maybe what a 12th night needs to be is a 12th night for 5 years, and that the great thing will be students will look at it and say, my God, that's so 2024. We just don't think like that anymore.
Yeah, I just follow up. And so what you're saying is because of the hyper-canonicity of Shakespeare, you are given space to create Shakespeare for this moment in effect. And one can say the same thing about Chaucer. One can say that we have scant Chaucer editions too. And I guess the thought is just that somehow this freedom to edit for now goes hand in hand with a kind of reinforcing of the status of a very select few authors within the canon in interesting ways.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the parallel for me is with performance. That if you get a production of Beaumont and Fletcher play up and it's no good, there probably won't be another one for decades. You've really messed up the chance to do it. I keep telling myself, if I mess up 12th Night, it's not going to be like that. But I mean, 12th Night won't die because of it. But more exiguous texts do die if they don't have if the editions don't work.
Liza, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me? Is this volume okay?
Brilliant. Hi, Liza.
Yeah, good to see you. So I wanted to follow up on the reading you had of Antonio. And I will say that my general position is yes, absolutely. Let's edit in ways that open up queer possibilities. Sure, I'm on board for that. But since it is Asexuality Week this week, I guess I just want to push at the idea that that language of adore means that we should be reading them as homosexually coded. Because in asexual and aromantic communities, friend love is something we talk about, right? The language of friendship is not strong enough. And so we borrow from love, even though there's not sexual attraction there. And asexuality studies as a discipline talks about compulsory sexuality and the assumption that everyone has these sort of desires. And so is there a way to think about what's happening with Antonio there that doesn't in opening up the sort of possibility of homosexuality doesn't shut down other queer possibilities like aromanticism, like asexuality? How would we edit in a way that leaves both of those options open?
Brilliant. Yeah, that's I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, and that's such a smart way to think about a kind of what you described as a borrowing of terms to amplify emotional impact when certain kinds of relationships don't have the cultural all the cultural weight which already endorses that. Yeah, I need to think more about that in relation to because that's it's a very odd scene, isn't it? The scene with Antonio and Sebastian. There's something very strange about the way Shakespeare constructs it, because we meet Sebastian, so we're just meeting him for the first time in the play, and what he is saying to Antonio is, I'm not the guy you thought. I'm not Rodrigo, the guy you thought I was. That's such an odd way for a playwright to introduce a character, saying, I'm not this identity that is never going to be mentioned again. But here's another name. I mean, it comes back to the sort of issues about naming, which I think are quite insistent in the play. So there's something unsettling about what the relationship between them is, whether and how friendship might now be required to toggle into master servant, and it's a great reading of Antonio's final speech to think about him reinvesting that friendship, that emotional bond, asexual bond possibly, with the kind of intensity that maybe Sebastian's tried to take from it. So I'm really, really grateful for that. It's such a good steer. There must be a way of keeping possibilities, and in fact, friend, sea captain doesn't seem to me to keep any possibilities open, although perhaps that's just a limit in my understanding of the sea captain identity. But I think friend actually probably is a word that I should think more about, and about that can be a bit more supercharged as a possibility.
Yeah, and just as a quick follow-up, the phrase like just friend does harm to both possible readings, right? Because I think you're absolutely right that there probably is a strand of editors who saw that and they were like, we're shutting that down, they're just friends. I don't want to explore that there's something behind that word adore. But like just friend is also something that's used to like invalidate, for example, asexual but homoromantic people who don't want to be considered merely friends just because there isn't sex as part of it, right? And so I think that those two readings are definitely interlinked. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Liza.
Thomas, I want to come to you next, but can I just jump in on the name question? Because, well, I mean, one of the things you talked to us so wonderfully is to actually like show us how weird it is that any of these characters have a name. So often when it's not only Viola, but that happens, Claudius famously in Hamlet, right, is not spoken. And so then you think, well, what is the name Viola for? Like, who's it for? In the folio, it's for a reader, but of course, they're not inventing it. We know that if Shakespeare is the handee of that bit of Thomas More, we know he's perfectly comfortable just calling people other, or maybe not giving them any name at all, but just marking the change of speaker. Certain characters don't get proper names, right? Like, Viola could have been called First Twin, right? And then Cesario, when in the First Twin, Second Twin, we get First Witch, Second Witch, Third Witch. They don't have names always. Or sometimes characters get names, but the editor refuses, and the speech prefix in the folio doesn't adopt it, right? So, like, the witches in Macbeth might have names. They sometimes refer to each other, or Hecate refers to them with names, but they don't get those names. So then, so where can we come to any theory of like, what is Viola for? The name Viola, is it? Are these cases where this happens sort of Shakespeare just inventing a fiction and needing a name to place a character like Claudius? Or is it important for the theater personnel to associate a name for certain big roles so that they can keep track of who's coming and going. Does the backstage plot have the name, Viola? It just makes me wonder, like, I get what Cesario, we understood some of at least the work of Cesario as a name of room in the play and why it's so important, as you showed us that great trick that playwrights have of introducing names, right? But with Viola, it comes back at the end. Doesn't really need to. You could say, like, my father was Sebastian, and he died when his daughter had 13 years or whatever. I mean, you don't need to say the name there, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, I just was to turn the question around and say, like, why do we get Viola at all? Before we read the play, right? Like, before it comes to us as a reading text where you think readers want to have, even in the period, we have some of that 18th century sense that readers want to imagine almost novelistically the life, this world happening, and so we get a name, right?
Yeah. That's an interesting point, isn't it? That do these names get consolidated as fictions when the way that Shakespeare is being valued is as a creator of character, and character has to have a proper name, otherwise it's a kind of do we feel dissatisfied by function characters? I mean, all the way through the Twelfth Night, the Orsino is called Duke. Should it be called Orsino? I mean, Duke. If you had Duke Clown, because you strip out some of these.
And editions have done that. I mean, there are editions.
Yeah.
Editions done everything. So there are editions that make a big point of, well, I'm going to call Claudius King or Orsino Duke.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting move to make, but it still doesn't quite address the issue of why do we have it at all? I mean, why not just call him Duke? Why do we know the word Orsino in the first place, right? When it seems so insignificant, when you start to look at that, no one calls him Orsino for all this time, or no one calls Viola, then why do we know it?
Yeah, and what's the spread of? I mean, the spread of character names is quite interesting, isn't it? That Violenta is a bit of bleed through from a different character, but mostly we expect it's kind of the rules, isn't it, that characters have. There's one character called a particular name. If there were more than one, if you had imagined your play world and you gave two characters the same name, even though that might quite likely happen in a seminar or around a dinner table, but if you chose to do that, that would just be, that's right. Sea Captain 1, Sea Captain 2. I'm seeing a very stripped out 12th Night.
All right, Thomas. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, and actually, Zach, my question follows on yours, quite well, I think, because I mean, you say, why do we get Viola at all? But I mean, from one perspective, you could say we actually don't ever get Viola, because the 3 times that her name is mentioned, it's actually unlike, I think I can't think of any other instance like it, where it's always in some kind of conditional. So the first time Sebastian says, if you were a woman, I would say thrice welcomed, you drowned Viola. Then Viola says, refers to herself in the third person. What does she say? And died that day when Viola from her birth had numbered 13 years. And then, don't embrace me until everything confirms that I am Viola. So actually, I mean, there's something very odd about, like, it's always in the conditional. So, I mean, you could argue that she's never actually identified, even within the play world, even at the end, as Viola. It's always some kind of deferred. I mean, I guess I was just curious, I mean, what if you had anything to say about that weird sort of conditionality of her name, which I can't think of another sort of instance like that in
but that's absolutely great. I can't think of one either, except it's not in terms of names, but maybe the sort of conditionality about all's well that ends well, or measure for measure, about those phrases, the way that there's a put into the conditional at the ending, and they sort of defer at the ending of both plays, and they defer the kind of the click which puts the play onto its title, and you feel it's holding, that they won't quite allow that. And maybe there's something similar about the sort of click of the name, sort of, I don't know why it's like a kind of toy figure for me, but that somehow attaches the name firmly to the character. I'm so pleased you pointed that out, because I hadn't quite got there. But you're right. It's a deferred identity, isn't it? The conditional makes it deferred, and what's it deferred? Everybody's in deferral, including Orsino or Duke. So maybe nobody wants Viola back. There's no place for her in this world, this play world.
That's really interesting, because the words versus the performance. I mean, I was thinking about this before, this relationship between Viola and Cesario. I mean, Cesario, it continues to the end, and plays, and so you start to wonder what those relationships are even at that point, how she views herself, or however that character views herself. Yeah.
And she's pathetically nameless at the end.
Right.
You're going to be Cesario until you become mistress, and then you become queen. So you're not becoming Viola.
Right.
Did you want to follow up?
Jason, isn't the point of her name at the end when it's introduced, in part that it's a rearrangement of letters of Olivia, and so she's always, I mean, her identity is very confusing, because when she's Cesario, she's performing Sebastian, and when in fact in that entry, the first 40 lines, I think on stage, if you see it and you're not reading it, there might be some confusion there with whether this woman on stage is Olivia or Viola, which I've always thought is deliberate. About 40 lines in, when you realize, when Olivia is mentioned, you realize this isn't Olivia, this is someone else, right? And so, in every instance where we see Viola, she's someone else until she's named. It's interesting. Contingent there on it, because even then it's sort of withheld. But I would have thought that the real discovery is, here's her name, she's someone, wait a minute, there's, maybe there's an issue of how she transferred or whatever, but even then we realize that it's a rearrangement of Olivia. So, I mean, part of what we're doing here is like circling the issue of parallel. So the editors want us to see C captain, because there's so many parallels in play. We're supposed to see Viola and Olivia, Sebastian and Viola, they're playing, Viola's playing Sebastian, and Antonio and Olivia as versions of one another, in the sense that, I mean, their sexuality sort of overlays across one another. So we read Antonio's sexuality as more potentially homoerotic or homosexual, or those moments, because they clearly are with Olivia, right, on the other side, with the other twin. So sometimes we can push that too far when we start pushing people into sea captain roles, right? But clearly the sea captain thing is
that's
some part of
interesting.
Shakespeare's intention.
Yeah, so I hadn't thought that before, that these structural parallels you're saying make things visible on sort of one side of the equation that wouldn't have been because of the other side. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that there's Viola and Olivia, and there's Malvolio, and there's a great trick about anagrams, and how foolish it is to look at anagrams or not recognize anagrams. So it's really hard to know what to do with all that, isn't it? Well, I mean, who's the joke on? So is there? Is it? Yeah.
Malvolio tried to force that. Sorry.
But Malvolio's been set up, hasn't he, with an anagram in which to see himself, even if it's sort of interrupted in some way. Yeah, I don't know quite what to do with that sense that of parallel between them. I don't know how that fits with the kind of sort of versions of homoeroticism which are about the same rather than the other, which are sort of problematic in lots of in lots of sort of ideological ways. Yeah, I need to think more about it. In your reading though, is it Shakespeare who's made the names the same, the anagrams? It's not that Viola has pitched onto a kind of Olivia kind of rearrangement. That's not what you're suggesting, is it? Or was it? Okay.
Like as if Viola invents that name right at the end and Sebastian goes along.
Yeah, I mean, there is some sense in which there's something odd about it. There's something odd about its contingency and brevity in the play, and yet the extent to which it has shaped that whole character as a movie.
Yeah, Javier and then Kiva.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question related with differences in edition, but geographical differences in edition. So I'm wondering if you find any difference between the editions printed in the Great Britain and some of the editions printed in the United States or in other Anglophone countries. And also, the other side of that question would be like, have you seen the translations of the play have these paratextual elements change also in different languages?
That's such a great question, and I have not done a full survey of these at all. And that's probably something I should do. It would be interesting to think about the translation of paratextual elements, because often translation brings out sort of ambiguities or different kinds of reading. So that would be a great thing to do. And nor can I see an obvious distinction between US and UK editions. One of the things that I've been very interested in is another character in the character lists, who is Maria or Mariah. And what's interesting about her is her social status. So she's variously called a waiting woman, an attendant. So Toby calls her a chambermaid, and some people say she's a chambermaid, but and I think he's probably being just rude. And then, of course, we've got Cesario's entrance, either cutely or genuinely saying, which is the mistress of the house, don't want to spend my... So that doesn't look like what you would say if the chambermaid was there and the mistress of the house was there. You're probably pretty clear which was which. So I have been interested in that figure, and I think that is a little bit variable across different editions, and that has an impact on. I mean, this is a play very, very concerned with social status. It's not appropriate. Malvolio is the person who gets beaten up by this play, and he gets beaten up for wishing to marry his mistress or imagining himself having married his mistress. Viola is not a threat to the play world, but Malvolio is, and if Maria is a lower class person, her marriage to Sir Toby challenges that. Whereas if she's a higher status person, it retains the sense that this is a kind of place of social class. So I think they're really, really fascinating, and your question has made me think that I should do more.
Sometimes about like the beginning of your presentation, you talked about your responsibility to the community as editor of such important series of works by very important playwright. I was thinking, because I'm studying posthumanism, there's a lot of nervousness about like the role of humanity. That kind of made me think about, is humanity still good, relevant, how does it stay relevant? And so I kind of realized, like, as editors, you make these works relevant. So because you also asked the question about, is it about now, or is it a retrospective, or should we look at the future? So I was thinking about the future of humanity when I talked about that responsibility side of things. Any comments on that? Because it kind of also made me feel responsible as reader. In the future, maybe I will direct students to read, like which versions, which edition, like things to read. Not only Shakespeare, but being mindful about the works like in humanities. So, any comments on that? Like, what are you also trying to achieve with that mindfulness?
Yeah, really, really important questions. I think that, well, this might be a very UK perspective, so I'd be interested to hear how this lands here. I think sometimes the future of the humanities questions in the UK suggest are tied up with culture war anxieties about particular kinds of politics of the now, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, they sometimes fall back on unexamined and rather sentimental ideas about the humanities as the defense for them. So it feels as if a sense that the humanities are vital and current and present and topical and difficult is not necessarily the story that either that either side quite wants. We either want an idea the humanities are the eternal truths, and that's our scientific colleagues will find out how to extend life, and we the humanists will help people live a good one. So that kind of not completely negligible formulation, nevertheless sort of puts us in the role of seers or sort of wise people who somehow transcend. I mean, that's what we've always said about the literary text, isn't it? That it transcends, it's transcendent in some way. And I wonder if some of the ways the argument is pushing us about putting pressure on the idea of the humanities might be pushing us back towards some of those arguments, when probably the argument we need to take up is I would think is a more unashamedly sort of present and political version of the humanities.
Heather, and then Hamid, and then we may run out.
Hi, Heather.
Hello, Emma. Hello, Pen, Material, Text. Good to see you all. I was going to say something about characterization, then I was very struck by Thomas's comment about the conditionals of Viola. So thank you for that, Thomas. I would really love to kind of go back to this idea of characterization, though, in the sense that I think a lot of female characters or female-coded characters, such as Viola and others, are not often mentioned by name for a very long time. We don't get a lot of them. They're kind of there in the secondary position related to, for example, their husband or their other relations in the world. There might be a daughter, things like that. The Duchess of Malfi, for example, similar kinds of things. I'm wondering if you've done any other surveys of that to kind of see under other circumstances that we have female characters kind of being, or female coded characters being kind of removed from the narrative like this.
That's a great question. No, I have not.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't until you mentioned it, particularly thought of it as a property of female coded characters.
Yeah, because I wonder if they're being kind of presented as a property.
Yeah, now you're making me think perhaps it is. Yeah, I just need to. I can't talk about that off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
That's fine. That's fine. But I wonder if there's a characterization factor there.
I'm just trying to sort of flick through in my head now.
Yeah, no, I'll let you do that while I talk a little bit more, actually, which is just to say that, like, I wonder how many of them have been ascribed she versus her, for example, as the pronoun by which we encounter the characters outright.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting.
it's fine that you don't have an answer. I'm
I
sorry to
don't-
simp you.
But I'm really grateful for the prompt, because now, and especially for the she/her prompt, because that gives a way of sort of some way of beginning to search for that, rather than
Yeah.
just a sense of looking through. Heather, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Hami.
Yeah, hi Emma, and hello everyone. It is 1:45 in Turkey. Emma, I'm seeing the tension between reading or analyzing the text by taking into account the past and the now and future. And I think Liza's question about thinking about further possibilities and having future in mind may be a way to move on. And in that point, I think I would like to revisit gender here and thinking gender and plurality, and especially the directions about Viola being in men's attire. And this is also a textual addition we don't see on stage. We are going to see Cesario, but whether it's men's attire or a eunuch's attire, we are not sure about it. So I'm kind of want to connect it to kind of like to Viola's or Cesario's desire to become a eunuch. And when he says, she say, they say, I want to become a eunuch, the sea captain immediately says, I want to be your mute, and brings the mute and eunuch couple, which we see in Mediterranean court of the period. And Cesario's name itself referring to cut off, right? There's castration in the name itself, kind of like the play as if wants us to think Cesario in terms of like eunuch. So I'm curious about what you have to say about eunuch part, which is that you may mention in discussion, and how we can go beyond man-woman dichotomy by taking into account eunuch as a separate gender, the boy as a separate gender, I don't know, a senior man or younger man as separate genders, so that the play gives us kind of like a future-oriented, I don't know, hints about possibilities that we don't know what we are going to see in 20 years. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great that's a really good question. So this is definitely, if it needs saying, a kind of non-binary play. I mean, this is a play full of non-binary kind of resource. I think your work on the eunuch, where I've thought about that at the moment, has actually been less about gender, and so obviously need to come back to that, and more about the place of the Mediterranean, the sense that the really interesting sense to me increasingly that Twelfth Night is a kind of Turk play, as Vitkus would talk about it, that the Illyrian, lots of things that we already knew about sort of come together in that, the Illyrian context, these very explicit references, the eunuch and the mute, but references to the Sultan and so on. That there is, and actually, I've been thinking about the sources for the play, which are much more clearly engaged with the wars against the Turks, much more interested in Cyprus as the location for the action, which is a sort of Othello kind of parallel. So I suppose I'm thinking about it as a kind of inside-out Othello in some way, and what I've really taken from your brilliant work on this so far is that that the eunuch is not just a kind of it's not at all a sense that this has gone wrong in the the arguments about the play, the actor not being able to sing and so on. These are kind of evasions of a whole strand in the play, which I think you have brought very vividly into context. So I think I need to go back to gender. What I've been thinking about, though, is I guess there has been race, and has been how this play about difference and shipwreck and arriving in a strange place that has so many parallels with Othello, yet seems to erase the work, almost erase, but not, the work of kind of race making, which is so important and so foundational in Othello. That's where I've gone with that. But I think you're absolutely right that the gendering of that and the possibilities of multiple genders in the play really expands out with the term eunuch.
I think we better wrap up there because we've made you go for quite a while. So thank you again for a terrific talk. Thank you. People who are here, please do come look at these editions that we have